60 hours. That's about how long it took for my dad and I to build this beautiful piece of furniture. A piece of furniture I will keep in my home for years to come. But that's not really the truth. Well, the hours part. Building this TV console is a result of years of building and creating, both on the part of my dad and myself. You see, my dad has been working with his hands for years, and growing up, he kind of made me do the same. Some of my earliest memories are of my dad and I working on something together. Growing up, I would come up with an idea and we'd build it together. From pea shooters to compressed potato cannons, he'd help me take an idea from my imagination and turn it into reality. But this is probably where the problem started. With this came a mindset of thinking most things are achievable to build yourself. For the last few years, I've talked to my dad about wanting to build furniture for my house. So after drawing up what I wanted, I convinced my dad to help me build the first piece of furniture for my new apartment. I hope you enjoy watching my dad and I take nothing more than a drawing and turning it into something real, and frankly, extremely pleasing to touch and look at. So our first step was getting our materials. We ultimately ended up with a mix of plywood and MDF core with a walnut veneer on top. We decided to edge it in solid walnut. Now, we didn't go fully solid because honestly we just don't really have the tools for that. 99% of what my dad makes is standard cabinets with plastic laminate on the outside. Because we ended up buying damaged sheets, we had to kind of be careful with how we cut the boards. We wanted waterfall edges on both sides, but had to cut around the bad parts. So you'll see coming up here that we were looking at the grain in the board and we wanted it to match up, but we were also kind of being careful about the different marks on the panels. Here we're setting the blade to a 45-degree angle. One of the key features of this piece was going to be the front edge that kind of juts out at the viewer. Once the board was cut at 45 degrees, we then glued on some solid strips of walnut onto the edge of the panel to make it appear more finished and kind of like solid wood. We chose to do this first so that we could get a nice clean cut on the solid edges when we came to cut it down to length later. This is us cutting down the solid wood to create those trim pieces that are going to go on the front of the boards. We then go on to plane and sand these pieces before they're glued on to the edges of the plywood. Because of the 45-degree angle of these boards, sticking the solid edges on was kind of difficult. I first tried just the tape method, but it kept sliding up and down. So for some of the pieces, I ended up having to add little clips to keep the pieces down as it glued. Ultimately, it wasn't the best method, and if I did it in the future, I'd want to come up with a new way to do it, but it worked. I think the real challenge with this 45-degree angle was actually trimming the edges flat. With typical edging, you might use a chisel and a file to get it flush with the surface of the board. For this, because it was a weird angle and it was solid wood, you couldn't do anything really traditional. So we ended up using a couple of different methods, between using a router and an actual hand plane. And that got the bulk of the material down, and from there we could carefully sand the boards so that this edge was flat or flush with the actual panel. I just wanted to point out here, this is what I was talking about earlier when I was talking about edging the panels and then cutting them so that we would get a nice clean edge after cutting. As challenging as that 45-degree angle on the front was, I think the real challenging part was the actual shape of the TV console itself. Because I wanted the sides of the TV console to come in, the angles of the two sides had to be 48 degrees. And this doesn't initially seem like a problem, but the real problem is that a traditional saw doesn't go past 45 degrees. So in order to get the 48 degrees we needed, we had to build something to hold the board at 48 degrees. We decided the best way to hold the cabinet together was going to be biscuits and glue on all four corners. And while there's better alternatives to biscuits on the market, it's just what we had. And from personal experience, now having the done piece in my house, I can say that it's more than strong enough. We had drawn up the piece in CAD, so we knew roughly what the bottom panel was going to have to come in at to fit. But the thing about CAD in real life is, well, sometimes it just doesn't work out like that. After the first fit up, it was just a little bit too long. So ultimately, I went back and forth on the saw a few times to get the fitment a little bit better. I did end up with a slight gap on the bottom, but I think if you were to look at the piece, you wouldn't actually notice that it was there. So after I cut the sides and the top and bottom to length, I started to work on the center dividers. So this is me cutting them up, and then I'm going to go through edging the front of the boards and actually attaching them to the top. Just a quick throwback here to when I was talking about edging the 45-degree angles. When you put a solid face on veneer, this is typically how you'll edge it. You come in with a regular router and you route down the bulk of the material, and then you'll come in and sand it smooth. Here I'm just laying down the lines for where the biscuits are going to go to attach the two dividers to the top of the unit. Ultimately, the bottom of the unit we decided to just attach with screws, since you would actually never really see them. So I think this part might bring a little bit of controversy to the comments, and that's because of the way that I'm clamping this piece onto the top. Really, I should have clamped it with a 90-degree guide on both sides, but I was kind of in a rush and didn't really have the tools to do that, and didn't really have the time to make the tools. So I left it to dry like that overnight, and the next day pulled it onto its top and glued the bottom on like that. Just to make this a little bit easier to follow, I clipped out the section where we built the record holder drawer thing. We ultimately decided to make it an inch and a half thick, and that was just so that when you had the drawer guides on the side, you wouldn't see them as much. It also just made it kind of more substantial, and I ended up really liking it. In order to get an inch and a half thick piece, we glued two 3/4 inch boards together and then just cut them down to size. I picked up an idea from a listing I saw on Etsy of a record holder to the side of the records. I really liked it because you could kind of queue up the next records you wanted to hear. So this part is kind of showing how my dad went about doing that. We found out that the width of the saw blade was actually enough to hold a record in place. So to start on the base, I made a template from the drawings that we had made in CAD earlier, and then we used that template with a router to get the exact shape that we wanted from the legs. And you'll kind of see in a minute here, after we put them together and glue them up, how that comes together.
Cutting for trim. Want to do that side?
No, you got bloody glue all over it. What are you doing? It's everywhere.
Just put it on.
Jesus Christ, what are you doing? It's gonna stick to it.
It's some move.
Right.
In this clip, my dad is routing around the template, and then he'll take the second leg and put it on top of the one that was just finished to do a final pass. After that, he put a roundover bit on the router and rounded over the legs. We don't have any footage of that, but you'll see it in the finishing process. Unfortunately, at this point, I had to take a trip, and so my dad was left doing some of it on his own. We're gonna skip timelines a bit and skip into me having already moved. I decided to finish the piece inside of my new house because my girlfriend wasn't able to bring it up the stairs with me alone. Two things that weren't recorded while I was gone was how the base came together and the back of the cabinet. So the base came together with Craig screws to hold both sides together. And then we used these little 8 bits to hold it to the bottom. We traced the back onto another piece of plywood and then cut it to an exact size. It was then cragged into the back, and you'll kind of see this in some of the clips for the finishing. I chose Rubio Monocoat for the finish on this piece, and I've never actually used it before, but I'd heard so many good things about it, and after using it this time, I think I'd definitely use it again in future projects.
There's a lot of oil up here on the corner. On the
And well, that pretty much wraps it up. If you've made it this far, thanks for watching. There are some pictures of the final product at the end, and feel free to stick around and watch them or don't. It's up to you.